I'd like to invite everyone to find a seat, stick a bookmark in whatever conversation you're having right now. Please, we want you to continue it later. And I also want to encourage folks to move closer if you'd like. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll give everyone just a moment to settle. Thank you, everyone, for coming here today. I just want to make sure I silence all my notifications so that I'm not interrupted. I want to thank all of you for coming today to this beautiful space. I want to thank Trinity Philanthropies for hosting us today. I was saying to everybody that, no matter how stressful your subway ride was on the way in or how agitated any of the issues we're going to be talking about today gets you, there's something that sort of soothes pain and conflict about being in this space, and it's wonderful to be here. We're really, really grateful for their hosting this event in such a timely manner because there's so much going on in the world today, and we wanted to take some time out to focus on some nitty-gritty issues related to charter reform. Before I get going any further, I want to get us started with a little icebreaker, which is also going to help us set up our audience participation process. We're using an audience participation app called Menti, MENTI.com. You can use the QR code here or the code that you see on the screen, or it's also on the little flyers that we left on your chairs to log into the site. And we have a little icebreaker question for you, which is just about how familiar you are with the ULURP process and the ballot questions on housing. And as you look at your mobile device, you will see we have so far a preponderance of ULURP ninjas in the room, but a lot of people with different degrees of familiarity with the land use process and the ballot questions, although so far no one has yet filled out, oh, there we go, what's ULURP as the response. Which is good. This sort of helps us understand where our audience is coming from. Obviously, some familiar faces here today, and it's great to see some new faces here as well. So keep that app open, that browser window open on your device, because later on, after I've completed some introductory remarks, we'll be using it for you to submit your questions for the Q&A segment of the discussion. We'll open the Q&A a little later on, and you can type in your question. And even if you don't have a question on your mind, you can look at all the questions that everyone else has entered and vote for the questions that you would like to hear. This is how we try to make our event as responsive as possible as we can. So, if you're not familiar with these ballot questions, and we tried to leave you a cheat sheet of notes on your chair, but if you're not familiar with the ballot questions on housing and land use, and all you've heard about them is what you've heard in the press lately, well, you understand that this is just another political power struggle between the city council and the mayor. Disputes over the charter are often a tug of war over the power that one elected official or another, even officials on their way out of office, have with respect to each other. But today I really want to push back strenuously on that framing. The main characters in this conversation are not elected officials. The main characters are the people of our city who need housing, whose housing is too expensive, who struggle to stay where they want to be, or who can't find housing near their family and friends when they need to move because they're getting married or divorced or having a kid or lost a job or are struggling with personal circumstances. They're the people who are sleeping in shelters or on couches or uncertain where they're going to be sleeping tonight. This conversation involves politics, but it's not for the sake of politics. It's for the sake of housing. We've dug ourselves an enormous hole by failing to allow the construction of enough housing for the people who need it, particularly those who can least afford it. You'll hear other conversations about who the political winners and losers might be from charter reforms. That's really not what we're here to discuss today. We're here to talk about whether these changes can help the city get to a place where we're better, more affordably, and more equitably housed. Oops. actually. That is what I'm talking about. Before this charter revision conversation began, we researched how our current land use process has been working at CHPC. And we found that there are incentives embedded in it that make it far easier to prevent housing than to allow it to be built. As laid out in our February report, the elephant in the room, ironically enough, copies of this are just outside the room. We have had elected officials who have made heroic efforts to help get affordable housing built, and that's important. But if it takes a hero to accomplish this, this means that we're never going to get all the housing we need. If we're going to make our way out of our affordability crisis, we need to make building housing an ordinary event and not an exceptional achievement. At CHPC, we approach this issue from a process standpoint. Are the processes we have and the incentives built into them oriented toward making our affordability crisis better or making it worse? Here are a few takeaways from our research. The original concept of ULURP, which was instituted in 1975, our land use process, was to begin with the airing of local priorities and perspectives and then move to geographically broader perspectives. The decision makers with a vote represented borough-wide or citywide constituencies. This was intended to achieve a proper balancing of local and citywide perspectives, to value local views without empowering NIMBYism. In 1989, however, with the creation of the modern 51-member City Council, the last vote in this process was assigned to the Council, a citywide governing body, but one with a natural tendency to member deference. This is the practice, the name for the practice that allows the local member effective authority over decisions in their district. Now, this is really primarily an issue about land use because land use is the only legislative arena in which the Council makes decisions of a strictly local nature. Local laws and other actions are citywide in nature. That's why we're talking about land use today. This change in 1989 disrupted the logic of the process and its outcomes, which you can see some of on this chart here. After these changes, there was a steep drop in the number of ULURP applications approved, specifically for housing. There were downzonings and there were non-residential rezonings, but during decades of record population growth, we approved fewer rezonings for housing. And the number of small residential rezonings dwindled to nearly zero. We're still today completing fewer residential rezonings per year than we were during the 1980s, when the materials were typewritten, maps were assembled by hand and X-Acto knife, and applications took more than a week to transmit to community boards by mail. The geographical distribution of approved rezonings for housing has also been highly inequitable. Because of member deference, it's enabled a council member, not every council member, but some council members, to effectively block rezonings for new housing in their district. Don't bother spending your time and money on this, I'm not going to let it happen, is an effectively chilling message that they are able to deliver. Unsurprisingly, the map of where housing has been built, which you see here on the right, bears a strong resemblance to the map of where rezonings have been approved. Another element it's important for us to think about as we think about geographical inequities is how demographic changes in the past 4 decades relate to these dynamics of the land use process. In the 1980s, New York City was a majority white city in which elected leadership was overwhelmingly white. In this environment in 1989, empowering locally based officials was understood properly as a way to prevent this majority from steamrolling low-income communities of color, a fresh memory from the traumatic period of urban renewal. Today, however, we've seen some of these patterns turned upside down. The city is more than 2/3 non-white, and so is citywide elected leadership. And while racial inequities are anything but a thing of the past, the dynamic of the land use process has in some ways been inverted. Member deference empowers a whiter, more affluent minority, and the ability of a locally elected official to stonewall new housing applications is effectively a tool of racial exclusion. You may wonder what I'm talking about with this graphic. Even when a local member is fighting for more affordability, hyperlocal politics can still undermine affordability goals. Committing a proposed development to provide more affordability sounds like an unquestionably good thing. But if that affordability can only be achieved with public subsidy, which exists only in a limited quantity, then making one project use more of it makes less affordable housing possible in other neighborhoods. And the neighborhoods where those resources are being drawn away, the ones that rely the most on those resources, the orange hippo on the right, who gets fewer marbles, are frequently low-income communities of color. This is the risk of the local frame on housing decisions, on decisions that affect housing policy more broadly. With all this in mind, back in February, in our report, we proposed a set of goals for charter reforms to address housing affordability. These goals included returning to the original concept of ULURP, of local voice, citywide responsibility, building into the process a check against member deference, promoting cooperation among the parties to the ULURP process rather than stoking conflict or rivalry among them, as well as making minor actions faster and less resource intensive and accelerating the most urgent affordable housing investments with procedural relief. These are all important goals in our estimation, and I'm happy to say that they're all reflected in one way or another in the ballot questions that the Charter Revision Commission has submitted. I want to pause for a moment, though, on this idea of promoting cooperation over conflict. Politicians benefit from conflict the way stock traders benefit from volatility. It's the geological force that drives political opportunity. This isn't because politicians are bad or ill-intentioned, it's just part of the job. But housing benefits from cooperation. Conflict can add friction and uncertainty and delay and cost and contribute to the scarcity that drives our housing crisis, which isn't to say that we should be ignoring conflict or that decisions shouldn't be scrutinized publicly. These are crucial elements of the public process. But the end goal is coming together to build something good, not creating division to stop anything from happening. Today's process imposes on even the most pro-housing local elected officials an incentive to delay, dodge, or defer the conflict that arises when a ULURP comes up in their district. It may be more palatable after their primary, or maybe when they're running for citywide office, or maybe never. Notably, the City Council recently approved 2 affordable housing developments over the objections of local members. This didn't escape our attention. This is a great thing, and we think it's really important to give credit where credit is due. But this doesn't disprove the logic of member deference so much as it's the exception that proves it. The only times in recent history that the Council has bucked member deference, in 2025, 2021, and 2009, have all come in the waning months of the 4-year electoral cycle, when the internal politics of the legislature are uniquely fluid. Other people can elaborate on what that means, fluidity of the legislative politics, more than I can. But if we're going to make housing an ordinary rather than an extraordinary accomplishment in which officials come together to prioritize citywide housing needs, we need to be able to do this during the other 90% of the political calendar as well. Which leads us to the questions formulated by the Charter Revision Commission and to our panel discussion in just a moment, where our esteemed group of experts will explore the implications for housing from these proposed changes. We distributed the Charter Revision Commission's 1-page summary of the ballot proposals so you can have a cheat sheet in your lap for the conversation. We won't be covering the topic of even year elections, question 6, and with apologies to any of the planning nerds in the room who got their hopes up, we're not going to dig into the digital city map either. You can catch us afterwards if you really want to talk about that. We're focused here on the changes that would create a fast-track review process for affordable housing, question 2, which includes an expedited land use process in the 12 community districts where the least affordable housing has been created in the past 5 years, and a process at the Board of Standards and Appeals for project-specific relief for subsidized affordable housing developments. As well as, question 3, simplifying the review of modest housing and infrastructure projects, smaller actions that could use the expedited land use process. And question 4, the establishment of an affordable housing appeals board consisting of the Speaker, Borough President, and Mayor, from which a majority vote could modify a council vote on a ULURP item in order to provide a check on the process of member deference. So those are the questions we're going to be talking about today, and without further ado, I am happy to introduce our moderator for today's discussion. Ben Max is a renowned veteran journalist who covers New York City and state politics, government, and public policy. You may know him from the Max Politics podcast, where he interviews leading figures from the politics and policy scene in our earbuds as we try to get in our morning workout, some of us, sometimes. Ben is executive editor and program director at the Center for New York City and State Law at New York Law School, and I'm happy to hand over today's proceedings to him.
Good morning. Asked our panelists to just come on up. Nobody get hurt on your director's chair. Hi, everybody. Thanks for this great turnout. So glad to see so many people out for this discussion. I think everybody has on their chairs the information on your speakers, so I'm not going to do bios and introductions here. We're going to get right into our discussion with this incredible panel that Howard and CHPC have assembled. Also, just a round of applause for Howard for that presentation and for CHPC on all this incredible work that the organization does. I'm a generalist as a New York politics and government journalist, and the value in expert organizations that do research like CHPC is just incredible to me, and I'm sure many of you in the room who rely on their work and these reports and these types of events. So very appreciative to everyone in the room who works there and who put this event and everything else together. And thank you all for being here. So let's get right into it here. Take a moment, if you'd like to just look at that sheet and who we have in front of us, because this is really an incredible panel that's been put together. So as Howard said, there will be six questions on your ballot this fall if you're a New York City voter. If you're voting by mail, you can already be doing that. So this is here. Everybody's focused on the mayoral election, of course, and that's hot stuff, and we can talk about that another time. But these questions on your ballot, the first one is a statewide question about some state parkland. You can look into that, Olympic facility stuff, and then we have the 5 city questions. So just know that the questions that deal with New York City issues are 2 through 6, right? And that's 2 through 5 related to housing, and really 2 through 4 on housing and land use matters, and then the 5th is the city map. Okay, so let's talk about these proposals. There's some complicated stuff here, and then in some ways, there's just a lot of big picture, sort of simple concept things, but that are really important to chew over. So let's start chewing. Meenakshi, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay. I don't think you need to do anything with your mic. So you have vast public and private sector experience, but in the public sector, a lot of experience with land use processes as chair of the Landmarks Preservation Commission and chair of the Board of Standards and Appeals, which we'll refer to as BSA for most of this conversation. So when we talk about the fast-tracking proposals here, so there's some fast-tracking in question 2, and there's some fast-tracking in question 3. Specifically, when we talk about these new processes, especially things coming before BSA, the Board of Standards and Appeals, what would this new process look like? What's your perspective on how this would work?
It's working?
Yeah,
okay.
There you go.
First of all, thank you, Ben and Howard, putting this panel together, and I'm really excited to be here to talk about a very important topic. So some of you know that the BSA is a body that is a part of the regulatory land use scheme in New York City. It reviews applications and provides relief to various owners outside of rezoning proposals and special permits that go before the City Planning Commission. So it really is a relief valve. And Right now, the processes that allow that relief to be given, mostly to the zoning code, is through a variance process. And the charter revisions address the issue of affordable housing and how it will be reviewed at the BSA. And it creates a simpler process where otherwise affordable housing projects, while reviewed at the BSA, have to go through a much more complicated variance process. So the process of the BSA is simplified, streamlined, and unlike the variance process, actually has a time frame associated with it. So projects that are applicable or eligible for the BSA are projects which are publicly financed, 100% affordable housing, and are brought forward by an HFDC or Housing Development Fund Corporation. Those are nonprofits that are affordable housing providers. So that's the sort of thresholds or requirements necessary to bring it forward to the BSA. The BSA reviews these projects, unlike a variance where the findings are much more straightforward and are tailored for affordable housing projects. So it requires the BSA to look and make sure it's 100% affordable housing, that the changes or variances to the zoning code will support and facilitate the program needs of the project. And this can be evidenced by supportive documents by HBD or any other funding agency. The other finding that they have to make has to do with neighborhood character. So it allows the BSA to shape projects to ensure that new affordable housing projects that come online actually are compatible with the surrounding context and also can screen off any kind of environmental impacts. From that perspective, it is a much more straightforward process than a variance, and it has a time frame associated with it, which is roughly 4 months, where the community board and borough president will still get an opportunity to weigh in on these projects, and then this BSA would hold a hearing and then be able to vote on it. And it may extend by another 2 months if there are issues that come up and the applicant can respond to them. So it's time-bound, and the findings are very straightforward and deal directly with, in fact, the housing project.
Thank you. The other fast track process in question 2 relates to basically what we might call a fair housing fast track in shorthand. This is creating faster review for projects in the 12 community districts with the lowest rates of affordable housing, and allowing the community board and the borough president to review at the same time, followed by a review by the city planning commission, and the city planning commission has final approval. What do you make of that fast track proposal? Any insights on how you think that would work in practice?
Well, I think that, one thing about ULURP, which is sort of the method that a lot of housing projects that include affordable housing have to go through the process, is that it's very blunt. So it doesn't discern between large major projects, the scale, the size, the need, the geography, and the politics. So I think this charter revision really is trying to aim at the projects that are not grand in scale, but are much more modest, or where the need is clearly identified. So one fast track is, as you noted, is where housing projects or rezonings really that have a mandatory inclusionary housing component and will deliver affordable housing can go through this route without going through ULURP. And it's only applicable to the 12 districts which have shown historically over the last 5 years that their rate of production for affordable housing has not been met. So it's very much geared towards diverting and enforcing actually the fair housing framework, which we anticipate will come out in October.
And lastly for you for now, the other fast track, which is now into question 3, is this idea of an ELURP, expedited land use review procedure. And this, as you were getting at in some of what you just said, is also about targeting certain types of proposals that are often just not even coming into your ULURP because they're more modestly sized, and developers who might be looking for that type of housing know that the costs and the time involved in the ULURP process, it often doesn't make sense to go for more modest projects. The idea here is that more modest-sized housing would get an expedited process. Will you say a little bit more about what that would look like in practice?
Right. So there are two types of projects. One is projects that, that increase density and allow for more additional housing. The standard is slightly different in the lower density districts. It allows you to bump up your FAR to 2 and have a height limit of 45 feet. So that's really about 10 feet higher than what is typical in lower density districts. The second is that if you're in a higher density or medium to high density districts, it allows a 30% bump up in the residential FAR. And in both cases, it's really limited to rezonings. It doesn't really take into consideration, or doesn't really allow, let's say, projects which have multiple zoning actions. So those more complex projects will go through ULURP. So one thing I want to say about both this route actually is that I think the most critical aspects are, number one, that the process ends at the City Planning Commission. So it's no more a political process. What it does is it allows, it's a simpler process. It's shorter because it's now roughly around 3 months versus 6 to 7 months, and it's much more predictable. So I think it will encourage development in places where we've seen historically no development taking place because of the political process. But it still allows the community board and the borough president to weigh in a shorter period of time. And I think one thing to note is that this is not necessarily uncommon. There are a lot of zoning actions that end at the City Planning Commission because of the scale. So authorizations, for example, whether they're heightened setback waivers, you have authorizations that allow bonuses, so increase in FAR, and you have authorizations that allow the transfer of development rights. All of those actually end at the City Planning Commission. So for those who think that there's something being taken away, I think I want to stress that these types of projects essentially are smaller in scale, that they're not that different from other projects that have a similar process, and that finally the projects have to screen off their environmental review. So anything that has an environmental impact statement actually has to go through a ULURP process.
I just want to underline for folks something Meenakshi said, which is, when I was first looking at these proposals, you see in the shortest language available that it says, an expedited process for modest housing development. And I'm sure, like many of you, the first thing that occurs to me is, oh, well, what does modest mean, right? And in a lot of the discourse right now that you may be hearing in the political conversation, it's a lot of big, broad strokes, but there are definitions of modest in the proposal. You have to look a little bit for it, but it's there, and Meenakshi just went over some of those details. I won't repeat them now, but if you want to see them again, you can find them. The City Charter Revision Commission actually just put out an FAQ document, and it's, I think, a 5-pager. These definitions that she just went through are on page 3 of that 5-page document. So, there is more detail under the hood here of these questions if you'd like to go look for that. And you can even go further into the details, obviously, with the actual, the actual charter change language that's being proposed. So there's different levels of specificity out there for you if you're looking to dig further. But I think that was one of the big questions that occurred to me, and I'm sure many others, when you first see an expedited land use review process for modest sized proposals. What does that mean? And there are differences for low and other density areas. Okay. Thank you for all of that insight and clarity. Ahmed, good morning.
Good morning.
Before heading the city's housing agency, you've been involved in other various government roles, borough president's office, the city council, and now, of course, leading the city's efforts on housing, and especially on affordable housing, and trying to meet the articulated goals for the kinds of projects that HPD wants to advance. So will you say a little bit from the HPD perspective about what kinds of projects have been difficult to achieve but could potentially become possible with these charter changes?
Yeah, I'm going to apologize for something in advance. There's probably something incredibly impactful and thoughtful that I should make sure I say, but when you're trying to run through your notes, it's usually the thing you forget, so apologies for probably missing that point. It's a little bit hard to engage in this question in a succinct answer because HPD thinks about this both as a regulator and oversight agency of housing writ large, particularly affordable housing that's under a regulatory agreement, but then also as an applicant, as you pointed out in your question. Like we have this dual role that the Charter Commission's efforts is trying to affect and advance in, we think, a positive way. From the perspective of a regulator and a policy center in sort of the larger housing ecosystem, I would say if you take a step back and think about the last couple of years, we collectively, for the most part, have bought into this idea that we need to critically look at every piece of our housing system in order to advance new housing. And what do I mean by that? We are looking, put aside federal advocacy around different tax code changes or advancing and making more flexible various funding sources we use to build housing on the local level. And in that flexibility is a look at codes, regulations, laws, again, with the background and the foresight to know that when we apply these rules and regulations as is, it has not been giving us the kind of output we need to meet the housing crisis that we're in. And then if you think about the last two state sessions, in 2023, adjusting our loan authority, which again is another example of how the rules were set up in one way to address issues, and then we said we need more flexibility to meet the need to advance community land trust, or we need more flexibility to be able to extend the term of affordability in our regulatory agreement, all of which comes with, and in 2024, renewing a tax abatement, extending one with changes that lean into affordability, extending the cap on residential floor area in high density districts, being able to convert buildings from commercial into residential. All of these are things that have pros and cons. They come with opportunities and risks. So I'm saying the pathway, this march that we're taking toward adjusting and taking risk and looking at our codes and regulations to see what is not working, what could be tweaked, where should we take more leniency and availability of our powers to advance housing is not new. We have been doing it over the last couple of years successfully, and it's creating bit by bit a better environment. Just recently, if you think about two things, big and maybe small, City of Yes, obviously a dramatic change in the building envelopes across the city, advancing an affordable housing agenda, advancing a fair housing and equitable agenda to look at every corner of the city, both for housing, but opportunity in many ways, access, mobility. And then maybe on the smaller side, and people don't talk about it as much, but the city advanced 2 years ago the Get Stuff Built program, right? We were looking at our regulatory scheme not only at HPD, but at DEP, DOB, BSA, across the board with the idea of trying to reduce the regulatory framework by the timeline by 50%, the permitting process, the process of having agencies request duplicative information and making you go back and forth. That time is also important, and that money is also important to put back into projects for affordability or ease. And we came up with a mechanism called the Green Fast Track. The Green Fast Track allows you to build housing. We looked at smaller lots and said, like 98% of the time, some of the processes that we make people do and spend six figures for actually don't yield any negative impacts to a neighborhood. So if you decide you're going to build, passive house, electric, not hit certain environmental standards, we're going to cut out an environmental step that you don't necessarily need, and we're going to save you 4 months and on average $100,000. This, again, is part of this march forward. And all of this is the technical side. From a policy perspective, the city has been leaning in, even as the federal government leaned out, to our responsibilities to advancing fair housing, right? So in 2020, we put out a report that really set the standard for what a city's statement is about their obligation to equitable housing, the Where We Live report. 80 recommendations where we just refreshed, issued out, put on top of it another 22 obligations to fair housing. And in that report, it talks about all these various ways, both operationally, policy-wise, thinking about the role of the private sector, thinking about the role of the public sector, to how to reduce our time, the money we spend, and the barriers to creating the basic foundation of security people need to be able to call themselves New Yorkers. Without the ability to have adequate roofs in this city, people will not be able to make this their home for themselves and their family in the long term. And so when we think about the charter reform questions, and we think about what they're trying to get to, it is in the same vein, in our opinion, as what we've been trying to do for the last couple of years, with support and the backing of people who work in this effort. We're seeing tailored, data-backed approaches that examine how projects move through the system, look at what is already required of them. If you're a project that's going to advance forward, you're going through DOB review. You have to meet certain code requirements that get updated every 3 years. And in those processes, there are challenges and appeal processes. So it's not like there isn't opportunities for people to be able to voice their opinion. There is the ability to go through that regulatory framework, but for HPD, and I'll switch to the applicant side, we are able to take projects that and treat them appropriately different, not have projects that are going to build 10 units be treated the same way as neighborhood rezonings. And the way we're going to get out of this housing crisis is if we advance all our lanes. We advance and we quickly make possible the smaller projects with a wider variety of developers who may otherwise be shut out because of the cost and complexity of working in the system. We find a way to be able to advance our responsibility for putting more public land into action, whether it's through organized committees with different agencies to see how we activate that land to yield hundreds of units of housing and also save on capital costs that otherwise would go into buildings that are dilapidated, or we look at all the different parcels we have and we execute on land use actions just to dispose if they are within the envelope that we collectively have gone through public processes to approve. And then I think the other part of it is, in addition to saving those dollars that would otherwise go into process and add years, but put that back into affordability or sustainability or resiliency or broadband access for those tenants, those things cost money, underwritten by term sheets and public dollars, so I'd rather take that out of process and put that into term sheets. The other thing is that, again, it creates this idea that more neighborhoods are going to be open to more people. And I want to give a shout out to the New York Housing Conference for the last couple of years. They started this trend of evaluating who is part of this process, who is approving rezonings, who is putting units out in the world. And that has opened the conversation. Hearing from council members saying, I want to be part of the solution. Hearing from community boards, I want to be part of the solution. And so that, in addition to the council's fair housing framework, our Where We Live report, all of these things, all of this climate that we're creating, pro-housing, we need to match that with tools that respect two things. People want us to be more reactive, effective, and deliver faster. People want us to create a system that's coherent, data-driven, and respects the fact that their voice should be part of this process, and that continues to be the case. And lastly, we need to do something about the fact that it costs so much to build housing. So if we want our developers, we want our communities to get the kind of housing they want, we also need to think about what we're doing to drive up the costs and bring those costs down.
Thank you. I don't think you left anything out.
I don't remember. Sorry.
No, it's okay. But if something else occurs to you, if something else occurs to you, jump right in. Speaking of those developers, that was a perfect segue to Simon. So you obviously can speak from the perspective of an active affordable housing developer, all the steps and decisions involved in the land use process, including pre-ULURP work, because there's always a lot of focus, of course, on ULURP itself and that extended process, but I think most people in this room know that there's extensive work before entering the ULURP process. But say a little bit about, as an affordable housing developer, how the need to go through ULURP changes your approach to a project, and how these potential changes here in the charter reforms would alter how you think about projects, what kinds of projects, financially, strategically, size, all of that. Go for it.
Great, thanks, Ben. First of all, good morning, everybody. I'm happy to be here today with esteemed colleagues. I'm happy to have the opportunity to talk from a development perspective, for sure. ULURP is really a process with a lot of barriers, both financial and strategic, and it really limits very much the type of developments that our community is even trying to attempt, right? And there's limited buckets that my firm would even consider at this point because of those barriers, and those really boil down to something that is large scale enough that is worth making the effort, right? Because it is so difficult and so expensive to go through the process. To attempt it on a private site, you really, really, really have to be sure that it is of a size and has a chance, right? So outside of something with that type of scale, the only other type of opportunities we would pursue realistically are something where we already have a property, right? And we own it, and there's no carry cost, so that we can just work on it without, absorbing the cost of holding and working over time, right? Or alternatively, you're looking at a project that's coming through an RFP where you're working in partnership with the city, and again, the carry is defrayed by that, right? And it is unfortunate that is the circumstance, right? It really limits the pool of projects that the development community is trying to do, even specifically focused on affordable housing, right? There's so many areas of the city, there's so many smaller scale projects that, just simply out of experience, I believe, the development community is not even taking a look at, right? And how many opportunities for affordable housing is that just, leaving out there? It's tremendous, right? Even with fantastic partners, with the city, with the state, you are still looking at, even under the best circumstances, with a large-scale project where you have even council member support, city support, right? You're still looking at a process that can take you literally 5 years before you even get to begin the ULURP process, right? And that's because there's so much engagement, which is not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing at all to really sink into the community engagement required to do so many of these projects, right? But I think it really harkens in the question that we're looking today at how the process has changed such that it really is deferential to the local community. Again, that's the community where it's going to be. There's definitely a role for that. But it is without a doubt that the balance between citywide interests and hyper-local politics have absolutely run into each other, with, unfortunately, the starting block really being those hyper-local politics, right? Where people can, cite, this street is now going to have too much traffic, right? They're going to talk about, maybe we don't have enough seats for kids in the elementary school. You know, those types of not illegitimate points, right, are at the same time kind of illegitimate, right? They weigh down the possibility to move, past, is there going to be parking on my block when traded with overall looking at the city? How are we going to have a city where significant people have an opportunity at affordable housing to stay here and live here? And while I would never suggest that these ballot questions are necessarily, going to change that dynamic completely, right? I think, as a city, as Ahmed was saying, like, we have to continue to try throwing stuff at the wall, right? And this is definitely questions that have been crafted by people that are really thinking about, really living through these processes and seeing how they do absolutely, drag the projects that people are willing to attempt. But I think even more so, probably killing projects that nobody is even willing to attempt, knowing the type of cost associated with and the type of strategy that you really have to employ when contemplating a land use process, without a doubt.
Just quickly to follow up a little bit on that, of the changes you see proposed here, is there one specific that you would point to that to you says, this would really solve a problem that I keep bumping into the most?
Well, I would say that, pointing at the process of, council deferential really is, probably the largest piece this attempts to alleviate, right? And in a lot of ways, I have met a lot of council members, and there's many, many, many great public servants out there, trying to serve their communities. But there's absolutely, parts of each community, right, that feel strongly about, certain things. And affordable housing can definitely be one of those things, right? And all of you who live in New York City probably realize, how many of your friends and neighbors, don't even know what community board they live in, right? They, have a faint grasp on who their council member is, right? But at the same time, there's generally a small piece of the population that's very, very aware of who their community board is and who their council member is, right? And you end up with, certain pockets of communities having an outsized voice, right? And that, in a lot of ways, as difficult as it can be for, the development community, HPD, CPC, right? It's just as difficult, in my opinion, for the council member themselves, right? Because they realize that there are certain pieces of their community that are at times opposed, and some of the positions they take are not necessarily the positions that they 100% are behind, right? And in that way, it seems to me that at least a possibility that I think has been broadly discussed is, it takes the full emphasis off of the local member, right? It allows for a larger conversation within the larger council with all the partners of the process to really speak about it and really get back to hopefully balancing, citywide priorities with local priorities, rather than giving so much sway to potentially, stop projects, at the starting block over, again, really hyper-local distaste for a project for whatever reason, density, traffic, that if you stop every project for, right, we end up in the situation that we're in.
Raju, that's a perfect place to bring you in. Your expertise from directing land use at the City Council and now on the City Planning Commission. We haven't talked that much about, but that alludes to question 4 and the establishment of this appeals board. Will you say a little bit from your perspective how you think that would impact the projects that get proposed, that get evaluated, how the process of negotiation especially at the city council perhaps, goes if there is this potential for an appeals board with representatives of the council speaker, the relevant borough president, and the mayor to potentially override changes to a proposal or the voting down of a proposal at the city council?
Sure, always happy to speculate and pretend like I know the future here. Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Howard, for pulling us together. Thanks, Ben, for moderating. Just want to, again, acknowledge what Ben said earlier, that I think it's so lucky that we have organizations like CHPC doing this thinking, having these conversations, pushing these larger ideas forward, because it's hard for folks in government sometimes to crack the seal, so to speak, on these discussions. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard to know with any degree of certainty how an appeals process might play out. So the way it works today, largely speaking, 95% of the times, if a member is opposed, they communicate that through the process, it actually gets to the city council. Perhaps that's a way for the member to strengthen their negotiating position and get a better outcome, or to ultimately decide the project doesn't succeed, and more often than not, an applicant withdraws at that point. That's, I'd say, 95% of the examples. Very rarely does the existing mayoral veto, I think, come into play. It didn't come into play when I was at the council. I think with the recent vote on the casino in the Bronx it did, but it's I don't know how many times the veto has been put in place, but it's basically a negligible tool, I'd say, from a governance standpoint. So this would replace it with this opportunity for this three-member body to make a decision that is contradictory or different than the local member might otherwise make. So that's my understanding of the sort of the description of the proposal. I think in terms of how it'll play out, I think to Howard's earlier point, I think it will likely encourage more ongoing dialogue between the member and the borough president and the speaker about what's the direction of a proposal like this, so that members, when they are taking positions, they feel like they are within the context of a broader political framework that can support them, if that's where the framework lands. And so I think it will, likely lead to more conversations between those actors than otherwise happens today. That certainly happens today. Elected officials are constantly talking to their colleagues about what they think and how they're approaching it. And certainly council members are constantly in discussions with borough presidents about that. Depends on those relationships, obviously. But I think this will formalize that in some way, make those conversations pretty essential to how any individual member approaches a negotiation on a difficult topic, especially if there's daylight between the member and the speaker and the borough president and the mayor. I think it'll force more of those discussions, and I think in the drafters of it, I think hopefully create more consensus around the outcome. So that'd be my speculation.
And to zoom out from your perspective on the totality of what's being proposed here, you've seen the arc of what Ahmed was talking about in terms of different pieces that have moved over the last several years. There's been a pretty big city council culture shift. That's part of what council members are pointing to in some of their criticism of these proposals. Obviously, that relates to the work of the current council and is not necessarily guaranteed to move into the future with new council members, but there's been a cultural shift. There's been a political shift. There's been a lot of changes in both policy and the conversation. How do you see these proposals fitting into that? Do you see them in any way as undermining any of that shift of the last several years?
So I think a lot, and this is probably the easy cop-out answer, but I think a lot of that will actually depend on what the voters do. Meaning, if these receive 70, 80% of the vote in New York City, I think everybody will take that as a signal that it's not the city we thought we had even a year ago. If they fail, obviously that will, I think, change the housing conversation as well. So I think what is interesting about this moment is it is an opportunity for the public, to the extent they understand these details, or even the concepts, let alone the details, to actually create a political moment around how do we think about the importance of housing. And I think that will ripple through the various units of government, the agencies, the community boards, elected officials, and will set a different course for the city, whether it succeeds or fails and by how much. So that's the cop-out answer. I'd say my sense is if they do succeed, that it will depend on the implementation of the first couple of years to help set a new status quo around how the city does land use. So I would say the first couple of years become more important. I think the agencies will have to pick their spots quite carefully at the beginning to sort of build some momentum and not start with, excessively fraught projects to try to build some momentum for a new consensus around this. So I think that's something that, for example, the projects right now that are being certified may end up being the projects that become the referendum on some of these things. So I think there's a little bit of, hopefully, work that the agencies are doing now, Ahmed and folks at city planning and the folks at BSA, thinking a little bit about that so that if this does succeed, that the first projects are validations of the idea and not reminders of the frustration. And then I think the other bit around implementation here, other than the first kind of couple of years being important, are, the agencies will have to redo some of their approaches to the way they work. Pre-ULURP feels like a four-letter word. I kind of groan when I hear it, and I'm not even an applicant, but, and so agencies' ability to actually process applications, move them through the process, not become bottlenecks, which they, I think, are, not because they're bad people, but because they're not set up necessarily to process the volume of work that they need to do. So I think there is a whole other management side of this and governance side from a kind of agency management that would need to actually catch up with this, because otherwise we might end up in a different problem statement, which is that we want to do things, but we can't do them because we have backlogs.
Yeah. You were named specifically, so you get a rebuttal.
I'm used to Raju calling me out. It's funny because one of the first people I went to when I was trying to think about, I was into council trying to think about how to approach a negotiation was Raju. Probably should have went to someone else, I think what he said were things that he said about approach and thinking comprehensively about what happens now, what happens later. All the things that he's mentioned then still hold true now and will be the case. One thing that I think is, from HPD's perspective, one thing that I'm not sure if we're getting out publicly enough is that for us, a lot of our focus on engagement, I'm not going to call it pre-ULURP, community connections before coming out with the proposals we want to do will not really be, we're not going to tone it down, and we're not going to, if anything, maybe we will continue to increase and try to embrace not only how we do it, the depth of what we do, the different ways we engage, hybrid models, online, in-person survey. We're going to want to do more of it. I mean, part of this will allow us to be able to take resources that otherwise is spent in a process that's taking money away from things like engagement. And for us, we in 2014 came up with the neighborhood planning playbook. That is a staple that's been copied not only locally but nationally about how to engage on public land. Our process starts through looking at community, if there's existing 197A plans, if there have been previous community vision documents. We, on a single site, will go through a multi-month process with in-person charrettes, survey work, online engagement, and craft a statement that is the feedback of the input that we get. Could we do more in getting more people out there? Maybe the idea that this is moving forward will actually activate more people to come to our events, and we would love that. We would love more people being part of our process to think about our public land. And I do feel that these projects that we have now we have to make sure that they reward the trust that we're being given if these move forward, and we're going to have to demonstrate our commitment to that engagement if we want to be successful.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback on what Raju said, which is, I think, obviously the overarching goal of the charter revisions is to produce more housing, to do it in a streamlined manner, to make it less expensive, encourage more developers or affordable housing providers to enter into the process. But I think that it's just part of the equation, and we're really talking about reforms that need to take place pre-ULURP or pre-certification, the whole application process. And I think some of the things that Raju mentioned, whether it's adding more resources, meaning staff, is training. I think part of it is changing the culture, which is if you have an expedited process, you should have people wanting to expedite that process. And I think just one other comment is that in terms of the negotiations that happen also during this period of pre-certification or pre-filing is also, I suspect, going to shift. I think the borough president's role is going to be very different. And I think maybe in a good way, I think developers, some of the clients that I advise, will think about these shorter processes. They're time bound. Is it better to negotiate earlier on? The City Planning Commission only has 30 days after the borough president and the community board. So there's, I think, a real benefit to work with the community board and the borough president and come up with whatever changes or modifications and shaping the project early on so that you can get to the end of the process quickly. I think in terms of ULURP and the change with the Affordable Housing Appeals Board is going to be very interesting because the borough president's role really kind of signals to the rest of the group what's going to be the next outcome in case the city council rejects it or modifies it. So it'll be, I think it's a sort of wait and see. And I think it's oft, as you said, it may take a couple of years. Maybe there'll be rules that are implemented. But I think the development community is going to sort of be watching this to see how that changes their own strategies when we start thinking about projects and getting them successful.
I'm really restraining myself from jumping in with thoughts on all the politics of how this will all play out. Howard, do you want to come up and talk about Q&A? We're going to I'm going to talk with our panelists here for a few more minutes, but then we're going to take some audience questions, and Howard is going to tell you how to submit those.
Sure. Just make sure this is, there we go. As you see on the screen, if you've logged into the Menti system, you should be able to see a open Q&A button, and you can submit a question there. We've already gotten a bunch of questions. I'll give you a couple more minutes to submit your questions, and then I will step back up and read a few of them off, and then give you a little time to wrap.
Great. So for those submitting questions, make sure you're multitasking here because your question might get answered while we're talking. It was referenced a couple times. The idea here, of course, is more housing production, more types, more quickly. Anybody? How do you just see in the big picture here, if these were to pass, how do they impact that larger picture? Does this supercharge housing production in the city? Is it sort of another step in this relatively careful set of modifications that have been happening over years that will then just add another layer of increasing production? How does this move the needle? Does it slightly move the needle on the bigger picture of sort of the housing supply that the city needs?
So anyone who knows me knows that I'm a New York Giants fan. And why is this? I'll make this relevant in a second. So we've got a new quarterback.
Sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
Better than being a Jets fan.
Yeah. We have a new quarterback, and he had this incredible, fiery start, and then a horrible, pitiful fall back to earth. And I say that because we should expect moments of great excitement, moments of maybe pullback as it gets recalibrated. There are projects similar to City of Yes or the restart of the tax abatement in the form of 45X. People need to take a minute, consider what the new changes will mean for the projects they're proposing, whether they need to go a different route, recalibrate with their teams. Then you may see like a fever pitch of excitement and people trying to use these tools. There will be lessons learned. The agencies have to figure out how to apply it and create the systems for it. And then there will be mistakes there. And then we will get better at it. And then maybe we will win a game against the Chargers. And then, again, it's going to be up and down for a little bit. I do think that it is something that works if other things are in place. So we need to have a capital budget that's from the HPD perspective. We have to have a capital budget that's responsive to the moment. We need to have staff in place and capacity, not only to do the work, but to fill in those other pieces of responsibility. If the community board and the borough president are both reviewing at the same time, that means that if it's not sequential, our agency has to be ready to talk to both with the same kind of seriousness and thoughtfulness as we would if they were going in different parts. So I do think that this will be impactful. I think it will be impactful on small projects with developers who might not otherwise be able to drive forward, but this makes it easier. It's going to help us with the question of the missing middle that we talked extensively about and is a national conversation at this point in cities, towns, and villages. I think it's going to help us in those places where we've had neighborhood rezonings where public land that we promised to advance takes longer because they have this pre-certification period that will be able to move forward. We said we were going to bring thousands of units of affordable housing. Now we could take it one step further and make the neighborhood rezonings complete. So I think it kind of depends on the track it's in. I think it depends on our ability to staff it and build the architecture right. I think it's going to have ebbs and flows. And then I just want to say one thing on the politics earlier. For HPD, we see, our engagement with the council isn't just on land use. We negotiate legislation, we negotiate a budget, we work in the communities, so we are incentivized far beyond land use to make sure we have a productive conversation with the council, and is in our best interest, is also our preference to have them as partners. So even if this were to change, there are so many other facets of our relationship that we manage and want to keep as partners that we will continue to operate largely like we do today.
Yeah, so, just to piggyback on that, I think from my perspective, I don't know that these, if they pass, necessarily, supercharge anything. But I do think that they, continue a road that, the city continues to try and lay out there to facilitate affordable housing development. I'm myself really curious, again, about what it does for those sort of smaller scale, those modest projects paired with City of Yes. I think we will see in the upcoming years, because there's certainly an appetite, there's certainly a piece of the development community that I think that really does appeal to. I think there's a lot of people who don't necessarily have the established firms, the balance sheets that are willing to really take shots at the opportunities that this potentially brings. And then I think on the other side, on the larger scale, and again, it's not something that could happen overnight, but it will be interesting to see sort of how the tenor of the discussions coming into pre-land use, on the affordable side will work, right? Like, again, like I think for practitioners, we will either be able to see or not see evidence that the balance between city priority and local priority, has shifted, right? But I think there's a lot of potential there. And I think the idea of an appeals board will be interesting to watch too, because, will it go from something, rarely if ever used, like a mayoral veto, to something that's more sort of par for the course, maybe par for the course earlier in the process as it begins to sort of rebalance, the decision-making process on, affordable housing wherever it is in the city, but specifically where we have not seen it in the last 10 years much, if at all.
Raju, did you want a quick thought, and then we'll go to an audience question?
I think, I don't think it will supercharge housing. I think, and we can try to put numbers on what supercharge means. But I do think, to Simon's point, that if it encourages people to continue, and policymakers and elected officials and communities to see the governance reform as essential activity, that it will actually, over the long term, be quite impactful. Because we haven't put this to the voters, really, ever, basically, or at least in anybody's political lifetime, right? So if it builds momentum for the work to come of then reforming building code, and then resourcing HPD and city planning and other agencies, and focusing on, environmental review reform and some of the things that Ahmed was mentioning earlier. If it builds momentum for that work, the sort of Ezra Klein agenda, so to speak, I think then it will be hugely impactful. But not because these individual proposals necessarily change the game, but because the political conversation and the consensus around this stuff is fundamentally changing.
I want to go to an audience question. Did you have a...
Yeah, just very quickly, I think that just in terms of some of the work that I do now, which is we advise property owners and developers, we do due diligence, we give zoning memos, and I think that from that perspective, there are opportunities within the set of amendments that we will incorporate. So there is this idea that you have shorter processes that are available, that if your projects are simple, I think a lot of developers are really looking for more density. I think they want more density. It pays more so than other things like height and setback, et cetera. So I think that since these revisions are really geared towards rezonings, I think it will open up opportunities, particularly in the 12 community districts, but also in the sort of medium, low-density districts. And
If we have time, I did want to ask more about those 12 districts, but
yes.
Let's see what our audience wants to know about.
Okay, so I'm going to I'm going to try to condense a couple of similar questions. First of all, thank you to everyone who submitted questions. I'm going to continue to try to monitor the stack of them and so we can keep the conversation going. And I'm skipping anything that is specifically about Jackson Dort.
That's the Giants quarterback.
Be warned. So there are a couple questions here about the new process at the Board of Standards and Appeals and this idea of considering neighborhood character. So one of the questions is, in a city with a growing population and need for larger buildings than exist in many neighborhoods to accommodate that population, how should we be applying the neighborhood character finding? Let's see, what does fitting into the neighborhood context mean in that sense? So I don't know, maybe Meenakshi is the first for this one.
Start off. So one of the things, or let's say the limitations of the BSA process, is that it's applicable where you are not changing the use. So we're really talking about districts where residential is already permitted. I think the issue of neighborhood character, I mean, there's some obvious common sense aspects that we all know. We've seen it in city planning, we've seen it in BSA right now, which is about the scale of the projects, it's about the height and setback, it's about how it fits in and affects neighboring properties. So I think that, how should people be thinking about it? I think architects and planners they're very skillful. I think they draw cues from the surrounding context. I think that one can look at something which is street-based, just across the street, or even larger. It's about placement and placemaking. If it's at corners, it can mark something. So, I mean, I feel that the finding is subjective enough to allow flexibility in trying to meet that finding. I don't know if that's helpful, but I think we've seen that, and people are creative. And I think there is maybe at some level more, I guess people are more receptive to higher density, generally speaking, for affordable housing.
I mean, the only thing I would add is that when we are thinking about sort of urban design question, especially on our public land. Over the last couple of years, we've established, greater coordination with DCP, and when we're thinking about we are looking at efficiently cost materials that do reflect the areas that we're working in. It's also like the context and constraints of the parcels that we're working in, and we have to balance between different principles that we are seeing in the neighborhood versus the material versus what changes we make kind of undermine, obviously, the delivery of not only the number of units, but the mix of units that we're trying to vie for too. And so I would say that using a mixture of those questions, trying to apply setbacks where it's appropriate. Again, I think people vary on this, but we're really trying to say, if you're walking down the street, what's the view that you're seeing and then what's above that? And can we play with the articulation in a way and the fenestration so that it is reflective of that neighborhood, but also keep in mind, and this is part of it, right? Part of the pro-housing conversation is that not only how do we build more housing, but how do we look at the costs of that housing and the trade-offs to the policy goals that we want to do. Plus, keep in mind there are certain policy initiatives like sustainability that then calls for building approaches that sometimes do not match the contours of a older neighborhood. Maybe whether you're talking about more glass or less glass, things like that. So I do think neighborhood context in terms of height, trying to respect that using setbacks, using like similar facades, those are really important, and we're going to continue to try to do that because if those are the things that you're getting hung up on, you can address that. It's the other things like the footprint or the ability, like how many units you're trying to build, what the units mixes, that gets a little bit more difficult. So at least if you're going to save your hard questions and your painful discussions, try to put that there.
Thanks. There are a few questions here that are what I'll sort of summarize as baby in the bathwater questions. How can we, what assurances do we feel we have that the changes won't cause new problems by throwing out some aspects of the process that are important? So for instance, this question of affordable for whom, when new affordable housing is proposed, how is the process going to, what guarantees are there that the expedited process will reduce costs for renters and not just developers? Other questions are about how communities can still have a productive role, communities or local council members can still have a productive role in shaping projects in this expedited process. How do we see the dynamic of local input and those local concerns that we think are an important and valid part of the interaction over projects? How do we see those playing out under the new proposed procedures?
So Jackson Dart. So if you look at community board recommendations, borough president recommendations, and ultimately things that we negotiate at the council, there is a lot of similarity. And very often, while there may be differences, affordability, depth of affordability is something that we see a lot of alignment there. So even as we talk about the new structure, the focus on the drive for affordability will be there. So that as a factor already gives us at HPD, which is in our inclination to want to do, an ability to try to make sure that our projects are building deeply affordable housing, whether it's the homeless set-asides that we do between 15 and 30%, the inclusion of supportive housing, which are people who can live independently, but then also have these beneficial services that allow them to continue to advance and create stability, or if it is creating a matrix of economic diversity up and through 120% of AMI. And if when we talk about affordability, we have to understand that it's creeping up, the intensity and the difficulty. This Community Service Society just put out a report not too long ago showing that the level of rent burden and lack of opportunity is creeping up to 80, 90, 100% of AMI. So yes, I think that there's the people who are involved in the process have typically echoed affordability, have been consistent. All three of those categories of decision makers will be involved in the process. We have a policy and mission goal to address affordability, and by again taking Soft costs that would, I love Meenakshi and I want to make sure that she has tons of work, but if we can take some of the soft costs and move that into paying for some of the hard costs, it allows us to be able to put more money toward things that doesn't drive up private debt, doesn't require a cash flow that, that makes it maybe more difficult to deliver more affordable units. It's not completely, like, that's a simplistic way of laying it out. It's not going to be that easy. And there's obviously going to have to be more analysis, but you have to start somewhere, and it's one of different checkpoints that you have to look at.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I guess I'd also say that, like, the tweaks to the process, don't seem like it's where, questions of affordability are really almost even make sense, right? Like, just, being on the end where, taking, when it gets down to, like, the issue of affordability in conversations that I've had with communities that are either, sometimes very supportive of a project, sometimes clearly not, right? The type of asks that we get are almost not even really, like, within our hands in a lot of ways, and certainly not within the context of what's being discussed with these ballot proposals, which really is affordable housing. And what I mean by that is that it really is very much dictated by the city already, right? It's dictated by the city by their term sheets, but then it's also dictated on the other end simply by where the project is, right? So I've certainly had conversations with community boards where they're pushing for units that are affordable to people that are at a higher income because they want less lower income affordability. And you're sitting there and you're like, okay, but, like, realistically, who's going to come here and try and even rent that, even if we provided that, right? And then on the flip side, you have asks for a much lower level of affordability. And again, that's great. And we've seen how through a number of different policy shifts, the sort of tiers of affordability have greatly expanded over the last couple of years. But it's not something that is determined on sort of a one-off by one-off project, right? It's more, a question for advocacy at large, right? Like CHPC, right? That is working in tandem with the city as a large to say, okay, what are we looking at? What are the pieces that we're missing? That missing middle that was brought up earlier, and how to start to address that. So I think that realistically, if these ballot questions go through, I think it is a step in the right direction, but I don't think it really has the sort of breadth to really be creating a situation where there's a missing piece, where people should be concerned that somebody is no longer able to put their hand on the tiller on the very local level.
Okay, and I appreciate it also, Simon, for you to throw the question right back to CHPC in your response as well.
There you go. Got faith in you.
This maybe gets to one of the questions that was on your list, Ben, but what would the consequences be for the 12 community districts that continue to produce the fewest affordable housing units? What do you think the effect of the proposed changes would be in having this expedited process in those districts which today have produced the fewest affordable units? And obviously we don't know yet which 12 exactly those are, but we have a general sense based on what we know about where affordable housing is and isn't built in the city today.
And then again, for people, this is the second part of question 2, faster review for projects in the 12 community districts with the lowest rates of affordable housing. Thoughts? Is this going to lead to a change in culture where council members and local communities don't want to be in that bottom 12, so Well,
I mean, I don't know. We don't know which of those 12 community districts, but we have a sense, and I know that there have been community districts where historically the council member has turned down many projects, and these are fairly discrete rezonings. These are not massive rezonings. And so I think that once this list comes out, I think there are property owners and developers who are just going to rethink whether there's another bite at the apple.
I think I would just add that I think it'll just depend on the mayor, honestly, this one. That this is going to be a political conversation for the next mayor to really decide how, I think unfortunately it's going to be a he, it looks like, but how he will make the choice about using this tool. And it's a little hard to say at this point, you know, we'll know more, I think, in the coming months on that point. But this will be, I think, a political decision as much as a planning one about how much to focus a fair housing agenda and a housing agenda as one and the same, as opposed to two separate questions. And I think it's a little hard to know. And I think it'll depend on mayors to come again if this thing gets approved.
One more?
Okay, one more, and then you can wrap us because we're coming up near time. The next question, I keep on scrolling away from me. I'm sorry. Walk us through a scenario in which the city council would reject or modify an application to create affordable housing, in which the appeals board would want to reverse the decision. I guess embedded in that is this question of when might the appeals board want to take up a council decision, and when perhaps might they not want to take up a council decision. And this is, of course, another speculation question, but we have great speculative minds on the panel, so thank you for considering it.
I'll take a crack at it. There's many flavors of affordable housing, as Ahmed knows better than the rest of us. So, let's take a supportive housing project, for example, where folks, who are formerly incarcerated, maybe suffer from substance abuse challenges, and it's a 100% affordable housing project, but in a sort of quiet, leafy residential neighborhood that's not accustomed to seeing that. And so that's a situation where you could see, these kinds of dynamics play out a little more, where, again, affordable housing is not all, despite the housing crisis, beloved. There are real challenges, and as Ahmed knows way better than I do, of citing affordable housing. And so I think those kinds of conversations around those types of housing might become easier for supportive housing, I would say, as a speculation.
Anyone else want to speculate?
No, just to build on that, I think also I'm going to speculate that us on the government side will just also have to continue the conversation about what our housing is built to do. So, I can imagine on the supportive housing side, one of the things that people don't realize is that much of our supportive housing is 60% supportive and 40% general. And with it, the thing that people are aware of is the complementary resources, the wraparound services. So maybe it's really, especially in those communities where you look at their community needs assessment and they say they want community resources for folks more generally in the community. So, in order to get through that, maybe we were doing it one way before, but possibly we need to think about supportive housing that not just serves the people in that building, but serves the community as one example of a way of changing our focus. Or thinking about the way that our buildings are laid out in places where there isn't enough open space, where we have maybe community residential restricted open space, and this is like the kind of thing that will drive you crazy, but we create it as more open and accessible to the public. Again, this gets back to something earlier where we are going to have to say that by giving us more ability to do more faster and to do it in a way where we are trusted with the responsibility of making decisions in this new way, we are also being more thoughtful about how we are constructing and shaping the projects we put forward.
We're going to leave it there. Round of applause for our panelists. Thank you so much, all of you. Thank you all for being here and joining us. Howard?
And a round of applause for our moderator. Thank you. And I'll just point everyone to our website, always, chpcny.org, for more information on this topic. Thanks for coming.